that ultimately improves outcomes for kids, and to have the necessary improvements negotiated and codified in a new contract, clarified vision, et cetera. The discussion today around interventions is somewhat similar, but also provides an opportunity for an authorizer to encourage a charter school in a formal way, right, to improve particular aspects of their programming as it relates back to the agreement with which you have with the contract itself and the charter school. But I thought it was kind of in the same sort of formal arena, perhaps a little bit more fluid and a little bit more wobble, but in a similar way. And I think we'll talk about today are interventions and formal and informal interventions. So here's what we'll cover. We'll talk a bit about interventions and do our best to sort of describe what they are generally. And we'll also then shift to talk about the principles for interventions, both through Colorado, the Colorado Principles and Standards, provide a sample intervention protocol that CACSA has as one way to sort of frame this idea of interventions and how to scale them or stack them, if you will. And then we'll then discuss the intervention and school improvement requirements. We hope that at the end of today's conversation, you'll be familiar with options that you have in developing an intervention protocol if you don't have one, but options that you have for implementing, sorry, too many I words, implementing an intervention protocol. And we hope that you'll understand some of the key state requirements for school improvement plans themselves. A formal, we're going to take a minute here to differentiate between formal and informal interventions. And in fact, we've had conversations about this over the course of the last few weeks, but here we'll draw it out a little bit more clearly. A formal intervention, so everything that moves on the left-hand side of this chart, a formal intervention is needed when there's a particular violation of statute, or a school violates or operates in a manner that's not consistent with the terms and conditions of the charter contract that you have, or if there's a health and safety matter at the school level. Informal interventions, sort of on the right-hand side, are often needed to respond to a particular concern that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a formal intervention. And some examples of this might include, late reporting requirements, parent concerns that are brought up to the authorizer or board members of the authorizer that are then left to you to address. Those may not lead to they could lead to a formal intervention, but ultimately we'll kind of characterize those as not leading to a formal intervention process. In those cases, the informal interventions, likely it's a call to the school, a meeting with the school, maybe a couple of board members and the principal or whatever it might be, but it's where you engage with the school directly outside of a formal process or a formal intervention. It's important to develop, and we heard a lot of this about ways in which you all, and I think it was APS at our last discussion, who talked a lot about the relationship that they have with their districts or with their schools. And it's important to use that relationship that you have with your schools during either an informal or formal intervention. When something arises that requires you to respond to it. And then when speaking about interventions during this particular session, we're going to be referring to formal interventions. Typically, an intervention is pursued in a manner that's consistent with a sponsor's intervention protocol. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So an intervention. An intervention is when a sponsor takes formal action as a result of a charter school not meeting specific requirements. And we talked about those being sort of statutory requirements, contractual requirements, health and safety issues. as well as performance, which could be contractual and statutory. Interventions are intended to alert the school to their deficiencies, provide clear information about what is the particular issue, what's wrong, and a timeline by which the school must correct the deficiency so that they can correct it themselves. I always refer to this as like a mini due process. You have to provide due process for the school to correct an issue. Interventions happen not because you're looking to sort of catch the school in the wrong, but because both the authorizer and the school, in good faith, have the same goal of ensuring students are being served safely and effectively. There are principles, and you have some principles for designing effective interventions. And there are 4 here I'll just briefly touch on, which, as you know, you're considering an intervention protocol or considering redoing or refining your intervention protocol, keep these in the forefront. The first is to be very clear about the conditions that might trigger an intervention and the potential consequences. This is, for me, was critically important, not even just for our staff, but also in clarifying what mattered. You should have a written policy, and the written policy and intervention protocol we may use synonymously here, that indicates what the conditions are that would trigger an intervention and what kinds of actions will result. The next is to give schools clear and timely notice of contract violations or performance deficiencies. This should be part of the ongoing monitoring and oversight that we discussed, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. The process of monitoring, oversight, site visits, et cetera, may surface particular matters that may rise to the level of an intervention. Each of the monitoring activities should result in written feedback. The third, allows schools enough time to remedy non-emergency situations, so matters, let's say, that aren't related to health and safety. And be realistic about the time frame for addressing issues, and also be clear about that time frame, especially if you were to write up an intervention. And then finally, engage in intervention strategies that preserve school autonomy. So, like, for instance, you might explain to the school the very specific challenge or problem, and then provide them the opportunity to figure out how to solve that particular issue. Here are some examples or reasons for interventions. You may identify these issues through, again, regular monitoring, complaints from parents or other stakeholders, or site visits. And so we're going to launch a poll here. And let's take a quick poll to check how many authorizers presently on the call have an intervention protocol. And we talked about it as a sort of a policy statement that you have that defines the matters that would be that would rise to a level of an intervention. It could be an intervention protocol itself, and sometimes it's also called an intervention ladder. Okay, so far with there's a good mix here of someone, at least one authorizer falling in each of the categories, but predominantly no and unsure are the responses to the poll. Okay, that's helpful. I'm gonna, yep, thank you. This is an example of an intervention protocol. And this is pulled from CACSA. There are 5 levels here that we can look at a little bit. Might spend a little bit more time here considering the folks that are unsure or don't have an intervention protocol. This particular protocol, in sort of its short form, but importantly, clearly communicates the kinds of conditions that may trigger an intervention. And importantly, the possible consequences for the school. It can't, you know, this isn't meant to account for every situation that you're going to confront, but does provide some helpful examples for clarity for the school, for the authorizer, for your board. And you could certainly create one for your own context, or, you know, within your district. Again, there's 5 particular levels, and this first slide shows the sort of lowest level. So if we consider this an intervention ladder, the first couple of rungs on that particular ladder, the notice of concern and notice of breach. And we'll just pause here. You can take a moment to read through some of the conditions that may trigger and the possible consequences for each of those 2 levels. Now, level 3 and 4, which would be, let's just continue on with the ladder. The 3rd and 4th rung of a ladder would indicate more serious concerns and therefore more intensive intervention. Probationary status indicates that the school is approaching a revocation review. At level 3, the school should develop an action plan or remedial action plan, if you will, that the sponsor would review. It's important that the plan comes from the school to protect the school autonomy, touching back to one of the principles, but that the authorizer should review the plan to make sure they believe it's viable and addresses the deficiency. A meeting with the school board and school leadership may be helpful to ensure that they're aware of the issue the school faces and have thoughtful plans to implement interventions. They'll move on to the last, which is the notice of revocation. And it's clearly the final stage before a revocation proceeding. And this is used, you know, perhaps when a school has demonstrated a trend of not meeting performance targets. The authorizer should provide clear notification that the revocation process is beginning, articulating the reasons why it's needed. Sometimes authorizers conduct a special site visit to gather more specific data about the school's performance. And, you know, it's likely that many of you have policy or statute that would help guide you through this last particular stage. We refer to it as a ladder where we're talking about the rungs, but there is certainly valid reasons to jump the rungs of the ladder and not do them in order or sequence, which of course would be directly commensurate with the particular violation that you're seeking to have addressed by the school, health and safety concerns or others, or a notice of breach that could then escalate to a notice of revocation. Just 2 thoughts from having some experience authorizing without an intervention ladder or an intervention protocol, and then with. 2 things that I felt were really important that were conveyed here. One is communicating with the school's board. I had not communicated early in my authorizing experience. I was more with my relationships were more with the school leaders and not with the school board. And I did not communicate with the school board. And when I started to communicate with the school board, it was like, oh, wait, what are you doing talking to my board? Well, technically they're the charter holder. So that became a different type of a relationship with the school and ultimately with the school's board. And in some ways caught the board members off guard, where they were like, wait, what? Like you're communicating with us, and it sort of animated action much more quickly. The second is I didn't adopt intervention protocol with 5 steps. We had 3 steps, probably needed 4, but just goes to show that, you know, as an example or a best practice, you could certainly modify an intervention protocol or intervention policy to meet your particular needs in your district. Okay, we're going to have a conversation with Paige and APS, and I see Paige. I'm not sure if she got pulled away from her phone or her computer. Nope, she's there. Oh, fantastic.
It's A lot of stuff going on.
I can appreciate it, Paige. Thank you very much, though, for joining, and thank you for your attention. I was going to have to go ad hoc here for a little.
No, I'm here for you
Okay.
guys. I'm happy to help.
Paige, you see the questions there. What does
Yes.
your intervention protocol look like?
So we're actually trying to, one of the things that we're working on right now is trying to codify it a little bit more. We have a lot of things in practice, but in terms of a protocol, as in like certain thresholds, that's what we're trying to kind of specify more for our district. But in general, our district is a little unique in that we have a lot of support staff for our charter schools that kind of walk that line between supporting them and also letting us know when there's specific compliance concerns. And then my office will get involved and kind of investigate to see what is going on a deeper level. Typically, we utilize our site visits and utilize that protocol to kind of determine what is a compliance concern versus how can we build more capacity at this school. And it's very similar to the ladder that we were kind of going over earlier, where our first steps are kind of reaching out to the school for clarity or to clarify certain essential components that are missing from their programming or anything like that, and trying to see if there's a piece that we're missing or if the school can provide evidence that things are still running smoothly. Sometimes that's successful, sometimes that's not. Typically schools will kind of give us that information. However, there's always those instances where a school may be more reserved. I always kind of fall back on that relationship building component, because that is essential to make that first step successful. When you say, hey, we have a bit of a concern, let's have a discussion about this, or let's talk about this. Should the issue continue, we start to kind of make sure it's documented, make sure our site visits reflect that concern, our annual performance reviews reflect those concerns. So that way we're able to document a pattern over time. And also doing our best to also acknowledge any improvement plans or action plans that were put into place by the school. We have sent notices of breach before. We have done a revocation before. And so it's kind of like you kind of have to go through all those steps to get to the next one. Typically, the notices of breach are that kind of magical step where it's like, okay, you have 15 days to kind of resolve this, or else we're going to have to take additional action. And we try to avoid getting to that point as much as possible through our support staff and through my office, kind of going through those. Nobody wants to do it. You know, it's not a fun situation to be in, but it's necessary sometimes. So some examples of when we had to intervene were we went through a revocation with one of our schools around special education. Essentially, there was a lot of miscommunication between our office and the school. I'm going to try to keep it in a nutshell because I could go on and on about it. But what we learned from it was that communication piece, especially when you have a startup school, and making those requirements and those expectations really clear. That was some accountability on our end and a lesson learned on our end. However, at the same time, the school was not compliant in this area. And we went through the notice of concern. We asked for more evidence of compliance or what exactly is going on. Some of that evidence wasn't clear. So it started to kind of push us through the motions of a notice of breach, and our board voted to revoke. What ended up happening is when they appealed with the state board pushed it back onto us, said, try to figure it out, come up with some type of plan. And we did. We created the corrective action plan with very specific criteria. And a bit of a happy ending. The school's still operating, and over time we were able to kind of clarify these components to them and improve our relationship with the school. As much as it was really messy in the beginning, the silver lining is through this process, as intense as it was, it not only fixed the issue, right? It also showed gaps in how we have in our intervention protocol and how we communicate out to the school. Other ones have been, other notices of breach were really around just technical components of the contract, severely low enrollment, not being able to have a certificate of occupancy or a facility. So those were more technical pieces that were a little bit more black and white than the first example.
Mhm. Hey, John, your first example, how much time passed from when you had sent the notice of breach to when the revocation proceedings were actually occurred, or whether or not just the threat of the revocation proceeding action?
So the notice of breach that we had gave them 15 days to rectify. And so I can't remember off the top of my head, it was a few years ago, but I would say it was pretty quick. It was like within a month or so that we were in front of our board. It was also special education. So a lot of people felt it was an area where there's a lot of risk associated with it in terms of compliance with IDEA and stuff. And so a lot of our leadership team in the district felt like we needed to move quickly to ensure that our district wasn't out of compliance with some of those.
And then Paige, what is it that you hope to be helpful by going sort of back through the work that you've done, the decisions that have been made, and then moving it into a more formal sort of intervention protocol?
I think transparency is so important in this work. So that way, when you are in these situations, it's very clear to the schools, to your district, what these protocols are. And it kind of shifts the focus onto the actual issue rather than all the noise and drama that happens when these things come out or when these issues are noted. And I think a protocol also informs, if I were to leave one day, how do you ensure that the practices are codified in your district and that knowledge doesn't leave with you? And that way, I could leave, but we have schools in our district that have been open 20 years, and you don't want to just shift your practices, so radically every time someone moves. So having a protocol in place, make sure that you have consistency for your schools and also your colleagues in your district.
That's well said. That's well said. I would have thought, from the last comments, just over the course of our few weeks together, it's clear that APS and your schools rely on the relationship that you have together. And so this mutual relationship, the trust. And it always struck me that strong relationships are enhanced by the type of clarity that you're looking at, because it's not me, it's not you, it's actually the school, the kids, it's this is a responsibility. It's not, it wipes away the interpersonal stuff. I was curious if that resonated with you or what you thought about that.
Absolutely. That's what I meant by like the noise around us and focusing on the actual issue, where it's like, this isn't a personal vendetta. This isn't a bias. This is, our obligation as, an authorizer. And sometimes I would like to, I feel like if it's a transparent process and you communicate these protocols in the beginning and it's understood, there might be more buy-in to working collaboratively to resolve it, rather than what we experienced in my first example, where it was just constant conflict. Our side didn't trust the school didn't trust us. And so it created a very difficult situation to resolve until we got to the state, and the state said, kind of figure it out. You two need to work together and find a resolution. And we did, which is, a lesson learned, I would think, in terms of my personal growth in this role.
Fantastic. And before I turn it to the whole group to see if anybody has a comment or an experience that they want to share, Alex did put in the chat that the model contract now does include language for an intervention protocol. Obviously, having that in the contract is a great way to keep everything consistent, right, in terms of treatment and expectations.
I'd like to add to when you said treatment, sometimes charter schools are very used to advocating for themselves. Very strongly. Some of them search for school leadership that's capable of doing that. And when you have a, you know, an unclear protocol, sometimes it could be perceived as, well, you're just doing this because you don't like my school, or you don't like my model, or you have a bias. And again, that kind of creates a lot of noise around the situation rather than actually focusing on how do we resolve this issue. And so having it in something like a contract and making it clear kind of ensures that equitable practice across all of your schools, which I think is also really important to be cognizant of.
Mhm.
If I can add one other point too, especially for our smaller authorizers that only have like 1 or 2 charter schools, the things that can go wrong don't happen as often when you only have one, as opposed to APS, you know, with close to 20, or, you know, DPS with a ton of charter schools. And so historically things will build up with a relationship that gets along and is functioning okay. And it's good to have this stuff built into the contract even in those cases, because some things that rarely happen do still happen, and you can have turnover in both the school or the district side. And so previous handshake agreements about how to fix something may not work anymore. So I do bring it up as like, these are good things to put in place if you don't have them, even if you have a good relationship, because they're meant to complement a good relationship, not replace it. And that if you end up having a small portfolio and the relationships go south or disappear, then you still need the tools, and it's a better way to handle a problem that will come up. So it's a plus, not a replacement for relationships. And it's good to have, even if you only have 1 or 2 schools in your portfolio.
Well said. Okay, thank you so much, Paige, for sharing. Okay, well, let me get back to there we go. So interventions in school achievement are, Paige had mentioned some of the compliance-based issues, which are more, I think she used the term black and white, kind of clear cut. Didn't submit these reports, or your enrollment's coming low, or your amended budget isn't balanced, you're running a deficit, stuff that's is unique in the sense that it's different from a more complex picture around student achievement and student achievement, especially in times of COVID. But we want to talk about student achievement in the intervention protocol, because student achievement should be the primary factor when we consider charter school performance. In Colorado, that means the state's grading system and annual goals in the contract. And the intervention protocol helps you all focus on how the school is achieving these outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about the accountability system and how it may impact your intervention protocol or your processes. We all know that your schools are evaluated by the state each year and given a rating based on their performance, academic performance, their academic growth, post-secondary readiness, to name them. And the schools that you oversee as an authorizer will be given this rating, and some may fall into the bottom 2 sort of buckets or categories of priority improvement or turnaround. Although your performance framework and the intervention protocol will likely incorporate the state's accountability system, you may also intervene for other reasons outside the accountability system. Schools that may be high performing in academics, let's say sort of the grand view, may be struggling in other areas of their contract or with a particular subpopulation. And your intervention protocol should incorporate state requirements for academic performance, but that doesn't constrain you as the only reason for intervention specifically related to student achievement. Your law includes specific requirements for schools that are on a turnaround plan. If a school in your portfolio is identified by the state as in turnaround for 2 consecutive years, the school is required to present to the board the details of a turnaround plan and a summary of the changes that the school will make in order to improve their performance and check in on progress that they've made in implementing these. If requested by you, the authorizer, they would have to show sufficient evidence that the school is making progress toward earning a higher accreditation category or rating. It may be important to keep in mind that the progress a school is making may be slower due to COVID, sort of consistent with the conversation we had prior to the session. And as an authorizer, be sure to stay up to date with the flexibilities that the state's providing with the state's turnaround plans to ensure that your approach is aligned to theirs, and perhaps a broader set of metrics like we had talked about that would be included. Okay, let's take a moment to look at a few scenarios, and we're going to go into breakout groups here in a second. Just checking on time. Yep. To discuss what you think the level of intervention a sponsor should take given a particular scenario. So shortly, you're going to go into a breakout room. You'll look at two different scenarios and discuss what level of intervention you think is appropriate for a sponsor to take. And we'll kind of use the notice of concern, notice of breach, intent for revocation or revocation is kind of a general framework to work on. But the closer you can get to choosing one, the better. And then we'll come back and debrief. And we'll do that for 10 minutes. So with that, Kelly and Robin will facilitate the rooms, and I'll invite Kathy to move us.
And we're going for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
All right. First scenario. School has not submitted compliance reports for a year, nor have they met financial health indicators for 2 years. Robin, level of intervention, what'd you guys settle on?
I think there was consensus around level 1, notice of concern, but that also depends, someone suggested that depends on the severity of the issues of financial health.
Correct, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because it could certainly raise to a much more significant intervention should the financial health indicators be dire, right?
Mm-hmm. But then
Okay.
One person thought maybe it should be level 2, but that depends on whether the authorizer had been providing follow-up and doing their due diligence. Like if they've been following up and asking for these compliance reports and providing, guidance about the indicators of financial health and it hasn't worked, then maybe it's level 2.
Certainly matters. Kind of touches on a point that Paige made around checking with the school to make sure that the problem is well defined and that the authorizer has all the information they need to have in order to define the problem that the school has, in addition to just simply being in communication and following up. Kelly, how'd your group land?
A little different. So we were talking more that it'd be at potentially level 3 or level 4. But most of our conversation was kind of filling in those gaps of information you don't know from this scenario. So we would hope that the authorizer has already given a notice of concern or notice of breach if this has been for a full year. And then our conversation was really focused a lot on what does this potentially mean for other areas of noncompliance. That financial noncompliance is oftentimes what you see on the surface, but underneath there likely is some other issue with administrative capacity. Could potentially be an enrollment issue at the school as well, but that those financial indicators are oftentimes tied to other areas of compliance that an authorizer would want to ask more questions around.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I think consistent across both groups. It depends as you get down into the layers and the specific issues around the financial health that might elevate the intervention. Okay, the scenario 2 was the school received turnaround in 17 and 18. The performance for students with disabilities was lower than the performance of students with disabilities in the district. Robin, back to you. How'd your team kind of process scenario B?
So similar to what Kelly was saying about scenario A, I think our group wanted more information. They wanted to find out how these issues have been addressed already, what other interventions have already been implemented. But they thought it could potentially be a level 3 probationary status, but they would need to have clear benchmarks for what progress should look like for the school to get out of turnaround status. But initially they wanted to get more information in order to determine what to do.
Some interesting points made there. Kelly?
Yeah, similar conversation with our group on that one around, this likely would mean that an authorizer would want to go into the school and look at what's happening, pull some local data to see if those trends are still occurring. And then also just talked about other tools you can kind of use to look at this, whether that's looking at teacher certification, looking at the school's UIP, looking at how grant funds are used, because if a school does qualify for a turnaround, then they qualify for funds from the state to implement improvement. So looking at how that money is being used and whether or not it's working could be a great conversation for an authorizer to have with this school.
And that you touched on a comment that Alex put in the chat, or I think it was Alex put in the chat, relative to the funding that's available for schools if they are in one of those designations. Any comments from the group related to the intervention scenarios, A or B? Takeaways?
I would say, as a board chair previously, these are all problems that could lead to somebody on your district's board saying, well, then for God's sake, why aren't we closing them now? And so you need to be able to sort of talk down your elected political leaders on this stuff and to have systems in place to sort of protect from them pushing you into something that just wouldn't be supportable.
And no better tool to help that talk down than the policy that they adopted that guides these decisions and the steps along the way. I thought another interesting point that was raised, and it kind of gets to the relationship and what role does an intervention protocol, or how does the intervention protocol complement the relationships that you've built, is if you were to have known that the school is doing a variety of strategies to improve student performance in scenario B, yet their outcomes still triggered or still hit a mark that was unacceptable, would you or would you not still intervene in a formal way? Food for thought, but I think my suggestion would be to intervene in a formal way to ensure that you've got it's communicated, it's uniform in how you treat schools, and then subsequent to that, engage in a formal document that then is an understanding of the strategies that they'll implement and the targets by which success will be declared or measured, which gives you, I think, a wonderful way to then work with your board and the school board to track progress and to focus attention. Okay, I will quickly share my screen, not for dramatic content, but because you should be seeing the thank you slide. Yes. Okay, man, I'm getting good at this. Just wanted to say thank you all again for your time and attention today. And before I give Alex the last minute, just a reminder that week 6 is coming up on December 15th from same time, same place. And Alex, anything for the good of the order?
Just to say thank you very much. That I will say that most of the CACSA model materials are designed to support these sort of tiered interventions and to give the authorizers more tools at their disposal. So if you haven't, check out the annual report format, the site visit rubric, the model contract. These other pieces all sort of fit together so that districts can execute interventions short of non-renewal. So really important. And I really appreciate everybody showing up and look forward to seeing you next week when we deal with special populations. So, and do the surveys. They're really helpful for us. So.
And that's posted in the chat. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.